Hello and welcome to The Print. Today we're joined by author, essayist, and writer Rollo Romig to speak about his latest book, I Am on the Hit List, Murder and Myth Making in South India. The book has been published by Westland. It chronicles the life and work of activist and journalist Gauri Lankesh from Bengaluru, who was murdered outside of her home right here in Bangalore on September 5th, 2017. Rollo's book delves into Gauri's life, death, and the subsequent investigation, revealing a world of teeming with political extremists, brave writers, organized crime, her work, uh, her relationships with her father, her family, her writing, and of course some shadowy religious groups. Well, thank you so much, Rollo, for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Well, Rollo, we'll start with the part where you, as far as I understand, you don't know Gauri Lankesh in person, nor have you met her.
That's right. Yeah, I never met Gauri, which is it's an
How
unusual
did you
thing.
come about to How did you come about to write such a definitive and a detailed piece chronicling her life and work? How did you come about to doing this?
Yeah, you're right. I never met Gauri, and it's kind of unusual to write a whole book about someone who you've never met. Although biographers do it all the time. But I'm of course used to knowing the people who I write about well as a journalist, and Uh, I'd been spending quite a bit of time in Bangalore in the years before she was murdered. I certainly knew quite a few people who knew her, but I never happened to meet her. I'd heard of her, and uh, and because I'd really been getting close to Bangalore and spending a lot of time there, I was even considering moving to Bangalore with my family at that time. Um, it came as a huge shock to me, just as it did to everyone else in the city when she was murdered. She was murdered on September 5th, 2017. I had just been in Bangalore for the month of August. I'd just left the city. So yeah, the news came as a huge shock, not just because it was Gauri, but because that sort of crime was such a shock in Bangalore. You just didn't think of that sort of thing as even being possible there. You just don't think of someone getting shot dead on their doorstep in Bangalore. You mentioned that the book gets a bit into the history of organized crime in Bangalore, and yeah, it's interesting. For much of the history of organized crime in that city, gangsters didn't use guns; they only used knives and machetes. Um, so just gun crime itself is really unusual. But then, of course, the person who was killed, the manner in which she was killed, just came as a huge shock. I went shortly after she was killed to start reporting on her murder for the New York Times Magazine. And even then, I wrote a long piece about her and the murder investigation at that time. But I really had the feeling that I was just scratching the surface of what was going on. And so, yeah, that's why it just, I almost couldn't help myself to just kind of keep pursuing it and keep writing it as a book.
Okay. Was she very different from the other journalists or activists that you had encountered in the past? What came across as striking, other than, of course, it was a gun crime in a city that rarely ever has a gun crime? Other than that, was there something about her that struck you, to write or investigate, or, delve deeper into this life and work of this journalist? At least until then, she was well known, but not as well known as, after her death, unfortunately.
That's right. Well, I really think Gauri was a one-of-a-kind person. And, I wouldn't have been so interested in spending years on a book like this if I weren't just so fascinated with her as a person. Ultimately, I felt like, I was pursuing this mystery of why she was murdered and who murdered her and all those related murder investigation mysteries But ultimately, as I spent years immersed in this, the question that most fascinated me, or the mystery that most fascinated me, was kind of the mystery of how to live a life and the sorts of answers she gave and how she lived her life. She was someone who really lived life to the fullest and really passionately prioritized what was most important to her, which was friendship, which was uh, being a voice against injustice. It wasn't money, it wasn't fame, it wasn't a lot of other things. And she made life difficult for herself in a lot of ways because she refused to really think about uh, making much money uh, or a lot of other things that come with that. And but I think this was something that when she was murdered, like you said, she became a lot more famous after she was killed than before. It's, I think, sometimes kind of forgotten that her platform was really quite small when she was killed. She was well known locally. She wasn't really a national figure. She would appear sometimes on, uh, news channels, panel discussions on the national level, but she was far from a household name on the national level until she was killed. And her paper was really had a small circulation and was struggling quite badly at the time that she died. She was talking with her colleagues about possibly needing to close the paper around that time. And but yet, after she was killed, there came this enormous outpouring in the streets of Bangalore in response to that. And it wasn't just because of the shock of her murder, it was because of all the many people and the many different kinds of people who she'd connected with. That was really remarkable. This is something that very few people ever do. And it was interesting because it seemed to come as a shock or as a surprise, even to people who knew her really well. Like, that no one, even those who knew her best, didn't really get the full scope of how she was connected to so many different kinds of people across the city, and that revealed itself in the protests after her murder. And so that really interested me a lot too, just how she just had this incredible ability to make time for people. When she knew a friend was in trouble, she was there. To the detriment of her sleep and everything else. And when there was a local cause that needed support, she was there, even if the cause was unpopular and small. And even if the circulation of her paper was small, she was often giving a voice to people who other newspapers were just not listening to. And that meant a lot to people, even if it was a small platform.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I mean, I recall, a little tidbit from your book in which I think after her father died and they were willing to wrap up the newspaper, that's Lankesh Patrike, when they have this conversation with Money, the printer, who says, don't give up even without trying. And then turns out that, then she continued to run a paper, far more passionately, perhaps, in her
Yeah.
later years.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing too. So yeah, when her father died, so the paper, that she initially took over was her father's, and he, of course, as anyone from Karnataka probably knows, who's listening to this, he's an absolute giant of Kannada literature. He was enormously famous as a writer on the state level, and enormously influential as a writer. And yeah, when she took over as paper Lankesh Patrike, well, first of all, no one was thinking of her as a candidate for taking over the paper. It came as a big surprise to the longtime writers and staff at the paper, largely because she was not fluent in Kannada at the time. She went to English medium schools, all the way through. And so it did seem like a big stretch that she would edit this Kannada language paper despite not having fluency in the language. But yeah, like you said, I think that's such a great example. Like, what motivated her was not, literary achievement. It wasn't like, next step in her career. It wasn't even sort of like the family legacy. It was the fact that the staff of this paper is not going to get paid if we don't keep going. And she felt a responsibility to them. That is so emblematic, I think, of the way that she thought, of really that sort of question was always her core motivation. Like what do people really need at a basic level? And pretty selfless decision making, I would say, too.
So why do you think that that she needed this reason to say that I am on the hit list? As in, she made this list. She made this hit list and she put her name there. Why do you think she did that?
Well, that's a really interesting thing. At the time that she was killed, there were already 3 other writers who'd been killed by the same modus operandi. So it was clear that there was a sort of pattern of writers getting killed. And, it's kind of haunting when you look back, the writer who was killed just before her, M.M. Culver, she was front and center at the protests after his murder. But no one, it really wasn't clear who was doing it. And the cases weren't really going anywhere. So there was very reasonable concern that there was going to be a 4th murder. And then she, of course, was the victim. So it actually became kind of a dark joke among certain sort of progressive writers in the region who's going to be next. And little did they know that there were actual hit lists being written by this group of conspirators who allegedly did the murders. That police ultimately did find a couple of notebooks with 2 different versions of actual hit lists of the people who they intended to kill next. But these writers didn't know this at the time, and they kind of had a running dark joke about a hit list. And she actually, like you said, made her own list and put herself on it. But, I think on some level, she never totally took it seriously. I mean, I think partly it was just her, like, braggadocio that she just, it was just her nature to sort of laugh in the face of threats like this. But I think it was also that, like, she was someone who was like, she was incredibly argumentative. She would argue at the drop of a hat and get in really heated, bitter arguments, especially about political stuff with some of her closest friends. Sometimes the arguments would be so bitter, her friends might assume, like, well, I guess our friendship is over now. And then the next time she'd see them, it would be like nothing had happened because she never held grudges. That was another, I think, really interesting and telling quality of hers, is that it just didn't occur to her to hold grudges against people, even if they were quite politically polarized. She was always open to dialogue, even if the dialogue was really heated. And even insulting. She was always open to more dialogue. And so I think because she had that quality so strongly, this is just kind of my guess, I feel like it was maybe hard for her to grasp that there were others who didn't really see it that way and who would hold grudges so hard that they would actually kill someone over it. And that turned out to be the case. So I think on some level it was just, she always, she's constantly getting in, Facebook and Twitter arguments with right-wing trolls. And she would invite them out to coffee. She'd say, let's keep talking about this over coffee. And no one ever took her up on it. But she actually was from a mindset that was a possibility. And that was kind of the world that she wanted. And she kind of lived as if that was the world that she lived in. Unfortunately, it wasn't the world that she lived in. It was a world where, some people are so embittered about some simple words that you say that they're willing to put a bullet in you.
In fact, I think since you used the thing about how she never held grudges, the particular statement that you use, that she never held a grudge against anybody, so she never took a grudge against herself seriously, perhaps. But her murder possibly was because of a grudge someone held against her.
Yeah, someone who never knew her, but yeah.
Yeah. So in your investigation, now, how do you characterize Gauri as a journalist and then as an activist?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because she evolved quite a lot as a journalist, like in her approach to journalism over the years. In the 90s when she was, coming up as a journalist, she was really quite a conventional mainstream journalist. She was good at what she did, but in a lot of ways, her career reminded me of my own career as a magazine journalist. Writing for these big English language publications, doing just kind of steady work, but not famous for it. She, like I, is like no no one ever really uh, knew who I was as a magazine journalist. Even when I was writing for um, uh, big magazines like the New York Times Magazine. Like, I'm not a famous name in magazine journalism, and neither was she. And she also kind of took a conventional approach, kind of a traditional approach to journalism, where you're neutral, you're objective, you keep your political convictions to the side from your journalism. And that really shifted after she took over her father's paper. First, it was, so first of all, she did learn Canada. Um, uh, you know, she got thrown in the deep end at her father's paper, learned Canada at least well enough. She was never perfect at it, but she was very frank in the pages of the paper about her deficiencies in Canada and about her struggles with Canada, but certainly became adept enough at it to write and edit in the language. And she wrote in kind of a free style. Her ex-husband described her written Canada as being like just loose street Canada, and she was like, "This is what I can do, so that's how I'm going to write." But in doing that, in writing, in shifting from like this national level English journalism to much more localized Canada journalism, she became much more immersed in the ground realities of her home state. She got to know her home state much more intimately than she ever had before. That's just what happens with local languages in India. Like that, it just gives you this access that English language journalism can never do. And it radicalized her. It really radicalized her. She saw things from a different perspective. And then there were a couple of issues that she picked up in the paper that started to shift her more to thinking of herself as an activist than a journalist. Even first, she thought of herself as she started calling herself after a while a journalist activist with a hyphen, and then after all, she flipped that, called herself an activist journalist. And I think by the end, she really thought of herself as an activist who, put for part of her activism was her newspaper. Is the way she thought about it. And yeah, she she abandoned a lot of the kind of conventions of journalism. She, much like her father, she would never use words like allegedly when describing crimes that she was writing about or people suspected of crimes in her paper, which got her into a lot of trouble. It opened her up to a lot of defamation lawsuits. In fact, she'd been found guilty in a defamation lawsuit not long before her death, and was sentenced to some jail time for that. This was, in response to an article where she had, not used the word allegedly, and she was out kind of on awaiting appeal in that case at the time she was murdered, and so things like that. She became looser with fact checking, which is probably not a great idea. I wouldn't recommend that. But I actually did. I feel like myself as a journalist, like I really learned a lot from kind of studying her example in her shifts. Journalism's changing so much and so fast. All the old business models are falling apart. Journalists are by necessity finding new ways of doing things outside of sort of the traditional framework of legacy media publications. But at the same time, journalists are taking this as an opportunity to rethink the old ways of doing things, the ways that you never questioned before. And one of
Mm.
those things is this idea of, pure objectivity, kind of pure detachment. And that was something that she really rejected. And it's made me think a lot about that too. Like, neutrality is a false position. There's no such thing as being neutral. Like, to be neutral as a writer is actually to endorse the status quo. And I think she really came to feel that strongly, and I've come to feel that too. Um, uh, in this moment of flux and in learning from her example.
Because I mean, she was, her journalism per se. The other journalists and writers that you spoke to, Girish Karnad or Sugata Srinivas Raju, and everyone, when she did take over from her father, some people saying that you didn't earn being an editor yet, or
Yeah.
Girish Karnad saying that her journalism did not really impact anyone as much as for someone to take her life. Or Sugata Srinivas Raju saying that they never followed anything that she did because in her journalism, because it was nothing as impactful. So, what do you make of her? How did she keep her paper alive? What were the kind of topics that she delved into so passionately and wanted to continue keep on writing them?
And she was barely keeping her paper alive by the end. I mean, she was at the end. She sold shortly before she was murdered. She sold her own life insurance policy in order to pay her staff. That's how dire it was.
Hmm.
Um, uh, she, it was when she suddenly became this nationally famous figure immediately after her murder. And and it was at this moment when journalists are under incredible pressure and in some cases incredible threat in India um, under the ruling party. It was understandably assumed that she had been targeted for her journalism, and it was understandably assumed that she was targeted because she was a prominent journalist and that her journalism was the most notable thing about her. And I don't think that's actually true. I think that she was an extraordinary person. She was a remarkable and highly notable person. But the thing is, she was notable for things that just don't really get, forget about fame and attention, for things that don't even get titles. Like, she was incredibly talented at friendship, which sounds like a small thing. It's actually a
Yeah.
huge thing. It's actually this thing that connects people and creates community, creates networks of solidarity, creates the world that you want to live in. When you have a true talent at friendship, like she did, and a lot of these things that she was super talented at are these kind of, it's this stuff that takes a lot of hard work, but it's almost invisible, and it's a lot, often it's the kind of stuff that's dismissed as kind of women's work, taking care of people, cultivating friendship, making plans, looking out for people even when there's no accolades or compensation for doing so. And why she was targeted. Well, I think a lot of it had to do with just she was very mouthy as an activist. She didn't mince words in what she wanted to say, and her speeches as an activist actually gave her a much bigger platform than her paper did. And so some of the things that she said in her speeches spread a lot more widely than anything that she wrote in Canada in this paper that just had a circulation of a few thousand copies a week. So some of what she said in speeches, and she was a very, unapologetic and fiery speaker. I don't think she even prepared her speeches very much. She just sort of mouthed off, when she got in front of the microphone. And uh, and some of those speeches, especially the most inflammatory ones, got circulated a lot on YouTube, which is obviously a huge platform. And that was when she started really getting some negative attention for some of the things that she'd said. But of course, a lot of the things that people were unhappy with that she'd said were completely taken out of context. it's an interesting thing in this pattern, like I mentioned, of these four writers who were murdered, ending with Gauri. Um, this is often the case. I mean, this is often the case in general with journalists who get targeted in India and elsewhere, is that their words are taken out of context. Um, Kalburgi seems to have been killed, according to the police investigation, for a line that he gave in a speech one time, where he was actually quoting the writer "You are Anantamurti," and the quote was completely taken out of context. It was misattributed to Kalburgi himself, and it was not only taken out of context, like it was put in a false context, and then that was amplified by some news channels operating in bad faith, just deliberately putting across a false message of what he'd said. Similar thing happened to Gauri. But at the same time, like, she said inflammatory things. Even her close colleagues sometimes would say, you know what, like, uh, sometimes I wish she wouldn't say such harsh things, especially when it comes to religion. It's a tough question. Like, she was an atheist, rationalist. She had a lot of problems with religion. A lot of her problems with religion had a solid foundation, but she was not diplomatic in the way that she talked about it. And, ultimately, like, whatever you think about religion personally, it means a lot to people. And people's feelings are hurt if you don't respect how they feel about it. Sometimes those hurt feelings are exploited in order to inflame political passions in a very cynical way. But sometimes those hurt feelings really are, pretty legitimate and should be respected. And that was a nuance that she wasn't always completely interested in. And no, obviously, no one deserves to be murdered for anything they say about anything, um,
Correct.
let alone religion. But uh, but yeah, it's such a complicated mix of things when it comes to talking about sensitive subjects.
Correct. I mean, there's even this part where, taking Girish Karnad's words, of course, saying that, I mean, whoever chose to murder, it was the wrongest person at the wrongest time. And overnight, she became sort of this national figure, even though there were three murders preceding her. No one got the kind of outpouring of emotion as much as Gauri did.
That's right. I really think that the murderers didn't really know what they bargained for in killing Gauri. I think they kind of assumed that she was a smaller figure than she was, and didn't understand how many people she was connected to. But yeah, it was also like, as Girish Karnad said, just the timing of it. There was already so much concern and outrage for how journalists were being treated in India, for how women were being treated, that it just struck a chord with many people even who had no idea who she was, and weren't even necessarily interested in who she was, but were concerned about the fate of journalism, the fate of women, many other things.
Yeah, because I mean, there are interesting aspects of her life that you capture. Of course, her family. All of us got to know about her family only after her death, unfortunately. But this side of her where everyone had seen her as this person with short hair who was, unabashed about her views. But the side about her that, most of her, the younger activists, she doted on younger activists who called her Amma, that she was the life of any party. Her friend circle never stopped, and wherever she went, she would use that space to actually go and meet more people. The part,
Yeah. Yeah, no, just this is something that's going to stick with me for the rest of my life. Just the incredible vibrancy with which she lived, uh, and just the way that she prioritized friendship. Something I think about a lot. I mean, my own middle age, it's hard to maintain friendships in middle age. So I think it's incredible that not only did she maintain friendships in middle age, she just kept expanding and expanding, like you said, her friend circle at that time. I think it's a real inspiration. in a lot of ways about how to live a life, how to live a rich and full life.
So, in your investigation now, you've explored several angles. Of course, there's of course Bangalore and real estate, the underworld, the Lingayat angle, the Naxalite angle, the right wing angle. Now, did you, let's say, come closer to a conclusion of what it could actually be?
Yeah, well, the police certainly did. The police ultimately charged 18 people and arrested 17 for conspiracy to murder Gauri. The 18th person is still absconding to this day. And all of these men were associated with, in one way or another, with this fringe regional religious group called Sanatan Sansta. Um, and many people had kind of informally suspected a Sanatan Sansta connection to these murders in the years before. But like I said, the earlier investigations really had made very little headway. In some ways, the earlier investigations were quite incompetent. In fact, in Pune, the investigators into Narendra Dabholkar's murder, he was the first in the string of murders. He was a prominent rationalist in Maharashtra. The investigators there hired a spirit medium to try to investigate what had happened to him.
In
It was
Pune,
actually a
yes.
former police officer who turned spirit medium who
Hmm.
claimed that he could possess himself with Dabholkar's spirit and that Dabholkar himself would testify to what happened to him. Obviously, this went nowhere. It did not lead to any actionable police intelligence, and it just wasted police time while the actual murderers got further away. So there was kind of an assumption, as soon as Gauri was killed, I mean, a lot of her friends and colleagues already felt cynical about it because they knew how these other investigations had gone. They felt, it was probably likely that this one would go in a similarly dire direction and lead nowhere. And for months, they heard very little from the police, which just kind of bolstered their suspicion that the investigation was going to lead nowhere. It turned out that the special investigation team investigating Gauri's murder was actually doing incredibly meticulous work, and they were being quiet about it because they were being careful not to reveal what they were finding, and they were actually finding a lot. Um, so they had a very talented team of investigators working on the case. At the beginning, the SIT consisted of hundreds of police officers when it started, and I detailed their investigative methods in the book, and it's really I found it a fascinating blend of kind of shoe leather detective work and high tech approaches. Everything from machine learning to AI, studying patterns in surveillance cameras to phone records, all this kinds of stuff, DNA testing, gait analysis, and yeah, it turned out, all these guys who they arrested had some connection or another to this group, Sanatan Sansta. Some had been members, some had been prominent members of the group. Some had just been active at their various events and actions. And Sanatan Sansta is this. It's this group. They're headquartered at an ashram in Goa, and led by a guru named Dr. Jayant Athale, and he's a former hypnotherapist, a clinical hypnotherapist, who kind of reinvented himself as a guru. And a lot of people have described uh, their operations as cult-like. I'm not an expert on cults, but this is what their neighbors say in Goa. Is they've caused a lot of controversy just in their local neighborhood in Goa because, for one, they've been hostile not just to other religions, but even to local Hindu practices that they object to. And they've made a lot of noise about Hindu practices that they think shouldn't happen. Um, and some, there's a sense that like their followers seem brainwashed. They, in kind of like typical cult fashion, when people join their ashram, they're apparently urged to cut ties with their families, that sort of thing. There has been a police raid at the ashram many years ago that uncovered enormous amounts of drugs. And there was a bizarre incident some years ago also where a field, a rice paddy adjoining the ashram was found to be filled with hundreds of used condoms that clearly came from the ashram. So, lots of just kind of mysterious and in some cases strange behavior coming out of this place. So partly for that reason, they're referred to as a fringe group. Their politics are referred to as fringe, although that I think is a little more questionable because their political program is really pretty much synonymous with the political program of the nation's ruling party. So it's a radical program, but it's actually pretty mainstream at this point. They advocate full-throatedly for a Hindu Rashtra, turning India into an explicitly Hindu country where non-Hindus are second-class citizens. And, the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi himself, has spoken approvingly of, they have Sanatan Sanstha has an annual Hindu Rashtra convention where kind of right-wing extremist groups converge every year. And one year, Narendra Modi sent them a letter of congratulations and regret that he couldn't himself attend that conference. So that just points to the fact that their program is actually pretty well aligned with that of the current ruling party. But it's interesting. There's this kind of interesting dance in which, as happens in many places, it happens here in the U.S. too, where depending on which way the political winds are blowing, the Sangh Parivar will kind of distance themselves or align themselves with fringe groups like this, depending on what's working for them at the moment. These guys who were accused of murdering Gauri all had one association or another with Sanatan Sanstha.
So, since Gauri's murder, and since you have reported on this, do you think that things in India has gotten worse, or is there a pushback against this sort of right-wing extremism?
Well, it's hard to say, because a lot of the damage has already been done. There's been this systematic effort to degrade and sideline institutions across the country, from the judiciary to universities to civil society, non-governmental organizations, the press. In many ways, that project has already been successful. So it's a project that we see underway in the United States right now too, and so have things gotten better? I don't see any evidence for that. There was some talk after Modi was elected to a third term that his mandate had declined and that it was a big setback for him. But I only really heard that talk pretty briefly, and it doesn't look to me like it's been much of a setback. But I will say also that since the election, I haven't had an opportunity to return to India, so I'm simply making these reflections from a distance. But this is what I hear from my contacts in India is that not much has changed.
So while reporting for this book, while investigating for this book, did you yourself face any challenges? Were there any pushbacks? Because you obviously delved into a lot of these people who probably are responsible for her murder. Of course, that it remains to be proved in a court of law. But so, did you face any challenges? Were there threats made to you? What are the kind of difficulties you faced while writing this book?
Very little, honestly. I mean, it's easy for me to kind of parachute into India and write about it as an outsider. My vulnerability to threats is much, much less than that of the many brave Indian journalists and activists whose work I relied on in order to write the book. I absolutely could not have written this book if there hadn't just been countless hundreds of Indian writers who are writing under circumstances in which they are under very direct threat, as Gauri's murder illustrates. It's the danger to me is very little, and especially now that I'm sitting here in New York, having finished the book, and I was very conscious of that all the way through, and I really So a book is a weird thing because it's this something that we think of as having emerged from one person's solitary genius sitting alone. That's not how a book is written. Certainly not a nonfiction book like this. It's an enormously collaborative process. And every page, every sentence is deeply reliant on Indian writers and thinkers whose work I drew on. And I guess to me, I see it as an opportunity to kind of leverage my own safety and to leverage my own privilege as an outsider to kind of bolster some of these voices that are under threat in India right now. It is really how I view it. Yeah.
All right. So finally, what do you think if Gauri was to actually see this book of you chronicling her? I mean, now that you know Gauri in a very what do I say, in a manner of speaking, that you know her so much better than when she was alive, perhaps. What do you think that she would have made of the book of you chronicling her the way you have? The kind of people you interviewed, getting them to speak as much as they did about her. So, what do you think she would make of this book if she were alive today?
That's a really interesting question. I love that question. No one's asked me that before. But it's something that I've definitely thought about. I mean, I hope she'd be happy with it. I really tried to do her story justice. And, I really tried to write it in a way that it's not just this sort of, one-sided celebration of her. I really tried to paint a complicated picture of her as a person. We're all complicated. And she was maybe particularly complicated. And I'd like to think that she would like that I painted a complex portrait of her, that I didn't just paint her as a martyr, which I really didn't want to do. I think that would in some ways tickle her, she was very open to being criticized and to criticizing herself in writing. And I think that, I hope that she would, I hope that she would like the way that I characterized her life and her talents. And I also just, I think that if I'd known her, that, I hope that we would have been friends, just as she, she became friends with, nearly everyone she encountered. And, I wish I'd had that opportunity.
Yeah, the reason I asked that question is because she would probably be the first one to joke about everything, including death.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. As she did joke about her own death before her demise.
All right. Thank you so much, Rollo, for talking to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate it.